So it's my great thrill to be introducing our first afternoon session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Daniel Padilla Peralta, and I'm a professor of classics. And I am greatly indebted to Max for extending an invitation to chair and moderate this panel. We have two presenters, and after the presentations, we'll transition seamlessly to our Q&A. Max informs me that we have already gone through the free speech protocol, and therefore I will simply remind you of the run-through of that protocol earlier today. And at the start of the Q&A, I'll offer some quick reminders about the importance of asking a concise question. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Professor Marina Magloire, who joins us from Emory University's Department of English. She will be presenting on Black feminist anti-Zionism and the practice of home. Please join me in welcoming Professor Magloire.
Okay, can y'all hear me? Okay, so I just want to thank Max for inviting me and for continuing in spite of everything. And I'm just so honored to be here, I think as a bit of a guest to Anti-Zionist Studies, which is not usually my scholarly area of expertise, but I guess what I'll be talking about today is slightly more recent research prompted by the events after October 7th. Okay. A year ago this month, I watched several of my students being loaded into a police van with their wrists zip-tied. I had lost them in the chaos when the Georgia State Patrol brutally crushed our Gaza Solidarity encampment within 2 hours of its establishment, visibly singling out Black and Muslim people for arrest and violence. I'm going to show a brief clip that I took on my phone of the beginnings of that repression, just so that people can kind of see what it was like. I found my students again when another student called me crying and told me to come to the parking lot behind the museum immediately. The spectacle had attracted a gaggle of onlookers who had not been involved in the encampment and thus had not had the experience of being tased, tear gassed, and shot at with rubber bullets as we just had. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Bring out the dogs next! Bring out the fire hoses!" Gesturing, of course, to the repression tactics that had been used against Black protesters in our very city 60 years ago. If it was a joke, it wasn't to my taste. If it was a threat, well, I've heard that one before. One place I've heard it before is in June Jordan's 1982 essay, Life After Lebanon. After a poetry reading in support of children displaced by Israel's horrific invasion of Lebanon earlier that year, she was physically aggressed by 2 Israeli poets, and at the reception, someone said, quote, "That Black woman should burn in a green fire." This was because she, a Black woman, had dared to stick her nose in something that only white politicians, generals, and media pundits were allowed to contemplate. In her words, she had learned in 1982 that, quote, no woman, and that certainly no non-white woman, should presume to think about / form an opinion / construct an analysis of any issue of conflict between any white men. Either the white men in this country will censor and block the publication of such a woman's thoughts, or they will whitelist and pounce upon her with such epithets as anti-Semitic and naive and divisive. Jordan's formulation was interesting to me because it is not just her Blackness and her womanness that are objectionable to this Zionist imaginary, but the fact that she forms an opinion from within this embodiment. This got me to thinking, what about a Black woman's opinion on Zionism is so threatening that it must be dismissed or suppressed at all costs? And what, if we listen to it, does it have to teach us? Last August, I wrote in the LA Review of Books about June Jordan's attempts to publicly criticize the Zionist stance of her friend, Jewish poet Adrienne Rich. In the midst of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Jordan's criticism was labeled by friends and enemies alike as anti-Semitic and dangerous to interracial solidarity. In this essay, I argued that Jordan's commitment to anti-Zionism pushed her friends' later support for the Palestinian cause. As some of you may know, Rich later became an anti-Zionist poet, and Audre Lorde also was implicated in this instance because she worked alongside fellow Combahee River Collective member Barbara Smith to suppress Jordan's open letter denouncing Rich, but Lorde later referenced Palestinian rights in a 1989 speech. So, in an interesting instance of historical symmetry, my essay, published in the midst of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, was labeled by a few other Black women as divisive in and of itself, disrespectful to Black feminist elders, and, quote, clickbaity. Y'all can decide that for yourself. In her famous poem, Moving Towards Home, Jordan's first stanza is a litany of Zionism's crimes, each beginning with, "Nor do I wish to speak about." Before she can get to the home she needs to speak about in the second stanza, she must consider all of the barriers in her path. In the same way, I do not wish to speak about Black people turning a blind eye to the suffering of Arab peoples, nor do I wish to speak about Jordan's words being suppressed by other Black women. I do not wish to speak about the betrayals of the queer civil rights organizer Bayard Rustin, who paid for a full-page New York Times ad in 1970 to assert that Israel should have all the fighter jets it needs. I do not wish to speak about UN Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield raising her lone Black hand on behalf of the US abstaining from opposing a ceasefire in Gaza. But in order to talk about home, I must. It is important to consider these instances in light of what Dana Olwan calls assumptive solidarity, which she uses to complicate the ties between Palestinian and indigenous peoples of North America, and to highlight the importance of moving towards an understanding of solidarity that does not conceptualize innocence or sameness as prerequisites for liberation movements and struggles. The assumption of an inherent Black and Palestinian solidarity can obscure the ways solidarity is built over time through relationships and rhetoric. For some Black writers, the work of solidarity was precipitated by trips to Israel and encounters with border walls and overt displays of anti-Palestinian racism, forcing them to confront their previously expressed sympathy or curiosity about the Zionist project, as in the case of James Baldwin and later Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, "I had gone to Palestine like I'd gone to Senegal in pursuit of my own questions, and thus had not fully seen the people in their own terms." The Israeli nation-state initially held an allure for some Black people, including Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Paul Robeson, Bayard Rustin, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. It is often rooted in their identification with Jewish people as an oppressed and forcibly displaced people seeking a homeland, and sometimes identified with Black nationalism. But I also want to emphasize that none of these expressions of support for the Zionist project were permanent or monolithic, and that some of these public figures shifted or even reversed their earlier stances over the course of long careers, as you see, most recently with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Much better known is the Black radical tradition of naming Israel as a racist, imperialist, and settler colonial nation, voiced as early as 1964 by Malcolm X. A variety of Black radical organizations, including SNCC, the Black Panther Party under Eldridge Cleaver, and Black Liberation Army, and individuals, viewed Palestinians as fellow people of color and as necessary partners in a global Third World Revolution, of which Black Americans were part. Michael Fischbach's incredibly thorough and in-depth research in Black Power over Palestine is what has allowed me to understand the rich legacy of Black men's anti-Zionism. But I say Black men's anti-Zionism specifically because his study rarely considers Black women outside of their role as the wives of more famous men. And this is how he describes the author of one of the first pro-Palestine statements released by an American organization, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in its newsletter in 1967. Fishbach describes the author of the letter thus: 28-year-old Ethel Miner surely had no idea she was making history when, in August of 1967, so the image of a hapless young woman innocently observing the controversy she had set in motion, like a child watching a row of dominoes fall, is at odds with Miner's role in educating her comrades in SNCC about Palestine, and her later organizing around Black and Brown coalition building in the South. Miner surely had some idea that she was making a public commitment that would be objectionable to many Jewish donors and supporters of her organization, but in the wake of Israel's actions in 1967, she published it anyway. In the aftermath of the newsletter and its fallout, SNCC lost so much funding that the Atlanta office in which she was based couldn't pay its electricity bill and had its lights cut off. Her comrades in SNCC, Kwame Ture and James Foreman, later criticized Miner's letter, despite agreeing with its overall content. Both thought that there should have been more consultation with SNCC members, including themselves, to articulate a position, and both seemed to disagree with the manner of the articulation, which Foreman called raggedy. Perhaps it was the open-ended, dialogical formulation of the article. Did you know that, each of the 32 entries begins, as it builds a narrative of Israeli aggression and Palestinian dispossession from 1897 to 1967. It is not a position paper, but rather an attempt at sparking an internal coming to consciousness. It is not about what to think, but how. Like Miner, June Jordan was also invested in anti-Zionism as a process of self-interrogation. In her unpublished open letter to Adrienne Rich, which here I'll go back to at least the beginning of it. And just as a note on this letter, it was previously unpublished because it was suppressed in 1982, but it actually does exist in Audre Lorde's archive. And last year, Writers Against the War on Gaza actually published it on the New York War Crimes website, so y'all can read it for yourselves if you would like as well. Published 42 years too late, but also right on time in a lot of ways. So in that unpublished open letter to Adrienne Rich, Jordan asks Rich the rhetorical question, does she remind all of us of the Israeli standards established in the Israeli trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, to wit, that you cannot say you did not know, that you cannot say you never pulled the trigger, that you cannot say you did not turn on the gas, that you cannot say you were only one among so many. Jordan holds these standards not just to her enemies, but also, especially, to her friends. Black feminist anti-Zionism is fundamentally a pedagogical practice of bringing others to the knowledge and allowing people to feel for themselves what action they must take in light of that knowledge. It is a manifestation of the Jamaican proverb, "She who feels it knows it." Black feminist anti-Zionism holds Black feminism true to its purported political goals and resists the co-optation, defanging, and manipulation of those goals by rights-granting institutions like universities and government agencies. Like other forms of Black anti-Zionism stemming from the Black radical tradition, it views Palestinians as a fellow oppressed people and as partners in the overthrow of oppressive global ordering systems. Black anti-Zionist feminism, however, is distinct in its conception of home. But first, I do not wish to speak about the falling out between June Jordan, Adrienne Rich, also involving Audre Lorde, and Barbara Smith, began with an open letter titled Feminism, Anti-Semitism, and Racism. Where'd it go? Okay, sorry, it didn't make it on the PowerPoint somehow. but it began with an open letter titled Feminism, Anti-Semitism, and Racism, Taking Our Stand Against Zionism and White Supremacy, published in the feminist periodical Off Our Backs in 1982. It was authored by Women Against Imperialism, a San Francisco-based group of anti-imperialist women, many of whom were Jewish. In the letter, the collective critiques, quote, a growing tendency in the women's movement to say that Jewish women are third world, or at least not white. This ignores the fact that Jewish people in America, despite anti-Semitism, are part of a white supremacist social order that holds down Black, Chicano, Mexican, Native American, and Puerto Rican peoples. From there, Women Against Imperialism make an argument for solidarity with Palestinian people based on the premise that, quote, the Jewish settlers in Israel play the same role as whites in South Africa. As long as Israel's right to exist is accepted, so is the colonization and genocide of the Palestinian people. This idea of Jewish complicity with global white supremacy was controversial in the women's movement at the time, especially among Jewish women who were attempting to theorize anti-Semitism as a form of oppression on par with racism and imperialism. This tension around Zionism in the women's movement was visually and discursively represented by a Zionist feminist statement on the opposing page titled, What Does Zionism Mean? It was authored by 6 women who went by the collective moniker Die Wilde Chayas, Yiddish for the wild beasts, the most famous of whom was the poet Adrienne Rich. Die Wilde Chayas self-identified as, quote, Jewish lesbian feminists of Eastern European background. Despite their awareness of the, quote, complexities of Israel's displacement of Palestinians, Rich and her co-signatories were unequivocal about Israel's right to exist, even in the aftermath of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and in a second letter published after the massacres at Sabra and Shatila. They said, Zionism is one strategy against anti-Semitism and for Jewish survival. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Perhaps most galling of all was their claim that anti-Zionism was also racist, since it refused to acknowledge that 2/3 of the Jews of Israel are people of color. Given that this statement was authored entirely by white American Jews, their concern for the plight of Jews of color feels more like a rhetorical strategy designed to shut down debate from other people of color than a genuine bid for coalition building. These 2 competing letters indicate that there was no consensus on Zionism, even among Jewish feminists, let alone among the non-Jewish women of color who found themselves implicated in the debate. Jordan was instrumental in pushing Rich away from this stance, and though they did not speak to one another for 4 years after fighting about this issue, they rekindled their relationship in 1986. But even after their 1986 reconciliation, Rich and Jordan continued to brush against old wounds, even as their anti-Zionist politics became more aligned. In 1987, for example, Jordan sent Rich an article called Homelands of the Mind, Jewish Feminism and Identity Politics by British Jewish Marxist Jenny Bourne. Like the 1982 letter by Women Against Imperialism, Bourne argued that, quote, although there has been massive persecution against us over many centuries and in many lands, we do not now face in Western societies the type of systemic exploitation which relegates Black and Third World people to the lower depths and threatens to keep them there. Bourne laments the way that she saw fellow Jewish feminists abandoning materialism in favor of their own version of identity politics, and she identifies the invasion of Lebanon as a key moment in which Jewish feminists failed to acknowledge the material realities of the atrocities committed by Israel in their name. In her reply to Jordan, Rich scathingly refers to this viewpoint as, quote, pretty predictable British Leninist rhetoric, and takes umbrage at Jordan's impulse to send it to her. What I would ask you to examine in your heart is why you sent me the article and what message you meant to convey. If you want to open dialogue with me about my relationship to the Jewish people or to the Jewish progressive movement, why not do that on your own terms instead of sending me this British woman's article? Indeed, Bourne quotes Die Wilde Chayas' July 1982 statement as an example of the bad faith conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, so Rich has some cause to believe that Jordan was making a pointed statement by sending her the essay. Um, in a measured reply, Jordan points out that she sent the essay to Angela Davis, Alice Walker, and Sarah Miles also because, quote, I felt eager to let my closest intellectual comrades have a look, whether they will agree or disagree with JB, me, or whatever. I am not particularly interested to open a dialogue with you about your relationship to the Jewish people. What I particularly want to do is share ideas as I come upon them and engage in exchanges of reactions, regardless of whether my comrades agree or disagree. She signs the letter with her love and an enclosed poem. The use of the word comrade to describe this set of friends is notable for its connotation of shared political commitments rather than the more politically neutral term friend. The goal gets lost if we assume that Jordan's 1982 reaction to Rich, Smith, Lord et al. Was a fit of pique rather than an invitation for public discourse about a political issue with people who considered themselves public intellectuals. It is not the fact that her friends disagreed with her in 1982, but the fact that they refused to engage with her ideas about anti-Zionism that hurt June Jordan the most. There are a variety of reasons beyond pettiness that Jordan could have chosen to send Bourne's article to Rich. A genuine desire for dialogue, a sign that their conflict was far behind them, and of course, a not mutually exclusive desire to say, I told you so. Jordan's enthusiasm for the essay makes sense within the wider context of her work. Bourne's critique that, quote, for Jews, what is to be done has been replaced by who am I, aligns tightly with many of Jordan's writings against identity reductionism. Jordan also believed that, quote, it is not who you are, but what we can do for each other that will determine our connection. Jordan's words serve as a reminder that their connection cannot be reduced to an easy identification of their overlapping identities as queer women, but must be renewed every day through a commitment to their stated liberatory politics. Sometimes Jordan's de-emphasizing of legible identitarian markers left her on the outside of her social and professional groups. Alexis Pauline Gumbs has argued that Jordan's identification as bisexual rather than as a lesbian alienated her from women like Barbara Smith, Audre Lorde, and others who faced professional consequences and interpersonal attacks for their public identification as lesbians. In Gumbs's words, quote, Audre and many other self-identifying Black lesbians interpreted the fact that June never identified as a lesbian as a betrayal. According to Gumbs and Smith herself, these personal differences around queer identification often had interpersonal consequences, as in the case of their mutual participation on a panel on Black feminism at the National Black Writers Conference at Howard University in 1978. Smith remembers, I was basically hung out to dry. It was a really blistering experience that day, not so much because of what people on the panel said, but what the 500 people in the audience had to say, which was basically that I needed to go bury myself somewhere because I was a lesbian. Gumbs describes Smith as traumatized by the events of that panel, notably by the fact that Jordan, who was moderating the panel, never stood up for Barbara directly. But in order to avoid replicating the false equivalencies between anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness, I also find it necessary to avoid equating the discrimination faced by American lesbians with the torture, death, and displacement of the Palestinian people that simultaneously was being underwritten by American tax dollars. Jordan's shortcomings as a panel moderator may contextualize the lack of personal allegiance that Smith felt for her, but they do not justify or excuse Smith's effort to censor Jordan's critique of Rich's publicly avowed Zionist politics. In a recent recounting of her opposition to oppose Jordan's 1982 open letter, Smith says, quote, we saw that letter being published and widely circulated attacking Adrienne Rich as being like an intervention that would not just make a rift among different kinds of women, specifically Black and Jewish women, it would make a chasm like the Grand Canyon. We're not talking about something minor. We were very concerned because we were trying to build something. The something that they were trying to build appears to have been based in a coalitional lesbianism whose axis of community appeared to be Black and Jewish women's shared experiences of homophobia and misogyny. Citing her negative experiences in predominantly straight spaces within the women's movement and the Black liberation movement, Smith says that as lesbians, quote, "we were so isolated, so marginalized, that places where we might have been involved in robust discussions about this struggle for Palestinian freedom, we were not necessarily welcome at those places." However, this insinuation that pro-Palestinian discussions in the 1980s might have been too homophobic to include lesbians does not appear to be based in an effort to explore the spaces discussing Palestinian liberation, as Jordan, who was also a queer woman, did. Even within multiracial feminist circles tasked with considering racism and oppression, scholar Keith Feldman also notes that, quote, "largely absent in Jewish feminist anxiety around Israel were substantive engagements with Arabs and Palestinians as subjects endowed with a complex personhood. Mainstream feminist publications, with largely white editorial boards like Ms. Magazine, pictured here, both reflected and enforced this aporia. Letty Progrebin, one of the founding members of Ms., regularly published and spoke in support of Zionism. In her June 1982 article, Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement, Progrebin equates anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism through the argument that, quote, "Zionism is simply an affirmative action plan on a national scale." To discuss Black-Jewish relations, she also quotes Barbara Smith to illustrate that, quote, "it is necessary for both groups to make an effort to comprehend each other's situation." Smith's diplomatic presence in the article, as well as the prominence and space the essay takes up in the publication, shows the immense influence of Zionist writers and editors in the circulation of feminist documents in the 1980s, and especially given the founding of Kitchen Table Press by Smith and Lord as a grassroots donation-funded operation in 1980, Smith and Lord could little afford to alienate Jewish allies in the publishing industry who could provide financial and other support for their nascent women of color press. Published 2 years after the incident with Jordan, Smith's essay on coalition building between Black and Jewish women, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, continues to walk the tightrope between Black feminist autonomy and the need for Jewish allyship. Smith is not afraid to critique the fact that Jewish women's desire for support and recognition has also resulted at times in attempts to portray our circumstances and the oppression of racism and anti-Semitism as parallel or even identical. This mentality is manifested at its extreme when white Jewish women of European origin claim third world identity. Smith rejects this competition between the two groups, but in choosing to emphasize and address Black women's anti-Semitism at a time of escalating Israeli violence, she also risks overemphasizing Jewish oppression and minimizing the larger threat of Zionist violence against third world peoples. Smith anticipates this critique and worries that addressing anti-Semitism, quote, "addressing anti-Semitism sets me up to look like a woman of color overly concerned about white issues. What I fear, of course, is losing the political support and understanding of other women of color, without which I cannot survive." But survive she does, and currently she is a vocal critic of the genocide in Gaza, both online and in her local community in upstate New York. But in the 1980s, her efforts to play both sides ultimately result in an unstable solidarity in which the Palestinian land claim is ignored, even as she argues in favor of Palestinian rights, thus relegating those rights to a murky, speculative realm. In 1982, she and 9 collaborators wrote to Jordan that though they did not agree with Jordan's attack on Rich, the statement that Rich signed indeed, quote, "reflects insufficient political concern for the fate of the Palestinian people." In a later letter to Jordan, Smith also called the statement lightweight, apolitical, and inherently racist. But even Bayard Rustin, known as Israel's man in Harlem, expressed concern for Palestinians and admitted towards the end of his life that they deserve self-determination, though being careful not to state where. Even Lord's much-touted reference to Palestine in her 1989 Oberlin commencement speech, calling upon the audience to, quote, "encourage our congresspeople to press for a peaceful solution in the Middle East and for the recognition of the rights of the Palestinian people," is one example of a rights-based discourse that ultimately serves as a blind for Zionist violence. The vague anti-imperialist rhetoric of rights and the supplication to the same governmental bodies that regularly vote to send arms to Israel is, in fact, the difference between more liberal Black feminisms and a Black feminist anti-Zionism that views the Palestinian homeland as a promise and a commitment. Because I need to speak about home, at the same November 1982 fundraiser, where Jordan's poetry sparked so much backlash, another poet was not allowed to speak at all, Mahmoud Darwish. Darwish had been invited by Jordan and other conference organizers to read at the event, but he was denied a visa. Darwish had just survived the siege on Beirut, against which Jordan had so adamantly protested earlier that year, and it seems like a great cruelty that the two poets were not allowed to meet at that time. They met, however, in writing and in mutual dreaming of a homeland foreclosed. In Moving Towards Home, Jordan writes that due to the acts of genocide against Palestinian and Lebanese people in 1982, there is less and less living room. Even from her position as an American citizen, watching these atrocities from afar, indeed, perhaps in her living room. Years later, in the wake of the Oslo Accords, Darwish also wrote, quote, "It is true that the occupation has left the bedroom, but it is still sitting comfortably in the living room and in all the other rooms. It controls the water faucet, the electricity switch, and the blueness of the sea. Is this not better than nothing?" There is a fortuitous parallelism between the two living room metaphors, both describing systems of foreclosed sovereignty in which an oppressive state continues to occupy the intimate lives of the oppressed, in spite of its alleged concessions and reforms. Both poets demand a living room that cannot be enclosed by the walls of someone else's house. In its title and structure, Moving Towards Home presents a forward motion, a restless search for a home at which Jordan never arrives, which begs the question, why isn't she home yet? Is not the American living room where the news of the atrocities in Lebanon and Palestine rolls over her in a wave of newspapers, broadcasts, and letters? Is that not the only home she has ever known? Jordan's poetry and prose is suffused with a longing for home. She has a career-long fixation on the concept, returning again and again to what it is not, where it is not. In her famous essay, Nobody Mean More to Me Than You Do, she describes growing up Black in America as, quote, "a house where every true mirror shows us the face of somebody who does not belong there." Black feminist anti-Zionism is a theory of home written by the women who have historically been forced to do the cooking, cleaning, and reproductive labor that make homes habitable. Black feminist anti-Zionism, in addition to being accountable to communities in the present, is also ancestrally accountable to a history of Black women's labor and homemaking, as demonstrated by Jordan's 1983 essay, Black Folks and Foreign Policy. Written only a few months after her falling out with Rich, Lord, and Smith, Black Folks and Foreign Policy can be seen as an intra-community reckoning based on the betrayals and complicities of 1982, speaking in no uncertain tones to the Black readers of the mainstream Black publication, Essence. She describes Black Americans as residents of the big house, and, quote, "What's more, we pays the massa for our troubles." Meanwhile, quote, "The fields belong to the Vietnamese, the Black people of Southern Africa, the Palestinians, and the brown and the Black peoples of Nicaragua, our victim cousins making their way to freedom." The historical role of enslaved people in the big house, according to Jordan, was, quote, "watching the massa do his thing, throwing salt or arsenic in his soup." Gesturing toward the weapon of poisoning and insurrections by enslaved people, Jordan does not indicate that the fundamental responsibility of those close to the massa has changed. In Jordan's formulation, from the safety of the big house, we have two options: throwing salt into the master's soup and thus making it more edible, more palatable, or throwing arsenic and poisoning the whole endeavor. Jordan's Manichaean formulation is meant to grate on the nerves of complicity. The house-field slave dichotomy is common in Black nationalist discourse, as in Malcolm X's 1963 speech, Message to the Grassroots. In an era of an oversimplified and gendered denigration of the complicity of the house slave and of the valorization of the resistance of the field slave, however, Jordan takes care not to dismiss the work of enslaved women forced to work in the big house. She says, quote, inside the big house, our mothers and grandmothers worked down on their knees so that we could stand up. They kept their eyes on a house ahead of them, a house full of family come to freedom. Now we sleep inside the big house. Will we let ourselves and our family in the fields just grovel down and die, domesticated by the master? Or will we join our cousins in the field and clean it up? In the house-field metaphor, none of the enslaved are truly at home. The lowercase house, where the mothers and grandmothers before us envisioned, is elsewhere, beyond the burning cane fields and the poisoned soup. The big house is only where we sleep. Home is what we build on top of its ruins. Jordan is making a Black feminist genealogical imperative based on the labor of enslaved women, which ensured our survival, but also demands justice on their behalf. It is a Black feminist politics based not on identitarian similarity, but in the mutual project of making the world a home worthy of our belonging. Black folks and foreign policy encourages Black Americans to understand that home is yet to be built, not in an idealized African past, not in a complacent American present, but in a global anti-colonial future. Now, if you'll allow me to end on a bit of a strange note, I'd like to read a bit of spirit writing that I did, or that I would rather say I received last week. So I'm originally a scholar of African diasporic spirituality, and spirit writing is a practice that I learned from the Black feminist poet Lucille Clifton, who, like Jordan, used her poetry to denounce the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, police brutality against student movements, and later the beginnings of the US War on Terror. In the 1970s, Clifton queried ancestral spirits about life, death, and the future of the planet. In this message, for example, the spirits are warning her that there is very little time for the world to prevent the world from turning into a hell. It's going to be her granddaughter's generation that is the cutoff point for when it's too late. I actually believe her granddaughters are currently in their 20s. So happy to talk more about that. But in the 1970s, Clifton received these messages through automatic writing, which is a practice of writing where you simply relax and let your hand write the words, following a subconscious progression like steps down a ladder. And the message that comes out is part you and part something else. When deciding whether or not to attend this conference, I asked June Jordan directly, "Hi, June, what are some reasons I should go to this anti-Zionism conference? Is it worth the risk?" She replied, Hello there, my dear. You are all on the path to something. It is more a matter of finding more people who will walk with you, so from that perspective, it is useful. Don't do it for fame or out of a sense of going to battle. That is not important. What matters is the way you are going to practice keeping safe with some people who can help. I still felt compelled to ask, what are the reasons not to do it? And she said, there are many reasons not to do it, of course, but none will change the reality of the risk. Thank you for practicing safety with me here today as we continue to walk in the reality of that risk.
Thank you so much. We will take questions after the second paper, but as we set up, I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Professor Sahar Aziz joins us from Rutgers Law School and will be presenting a paper entitled "The Anti-Semitism of Essentializing Jews in Anti-Discrimination Law." So we will get the slideshow going, and then it will be her turn to present.
Assalamu alaikum. Ooh, that was loud. Ahlan wa sahlan. Well, that was a tough speech to follow. That is a tough speech to follow. It was beautiful. Lawyers are not nearly as poetic. Most of the time, people don't like us, but these days, people are looking for us for all the wrong reasons. Okay, so I am going to apply my interest and expertise in civil rights law to explain why the dominant definition or the predominant definition of anti-Semitism is actually quite anti-Semitic. So let me see if I can persuade you. So first, I'll make, the key points I want to make is that anti-discrimination law encompasses anti-stereotyping principles, among other principles, that effectively reject the essentialization of persons within protected groups as homogeneous or monolithic. And if you look at Jews, they, in the United States, which is what I'm focusing on, as we've discussed in this conference, they are anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, post-Zionist, religious Zionists, cultural Zionists, and other forms of Zionisms. So they're quite diverse. And therefore, if the legal definition of anti-Semitism conflates Zionism with Judaism, then you effectively are perpetuating the anti-Semitic essentialization of a diverse global religious community as monolithic and homogeneous in their political beliefs, in their religious traditions, and in their relationship with the nation state of Israel. Now, I am a lawyer, so let me just be clear for all my fans. There's a lot of speakers here who have a lot of fans. Their fans aren't very nice. And they tend to engage in ad hominem attacks, which is a reflection of very poor argumentation skills and poor reasoning. If you feel uncomfortable, offended, or unsafe, please be advised that you are free to leave now or at any time during the presentation. Your attendance here is completely voluntary and signifies your consent to listen and expose yourself to the ideas in this presentation. By voluntarily listening to this presentation, either in person or later, you are assuming the risk of being offended, feeling uncomfortable, disagreeing with the ideas proffered, or any other psychological or emotional responses. No content in this presentation is intended to harm physically, psychologically, or materially Jews, Palestinians, or any other persons. And of course, the views expressed here therein are not the views of Rutgers University or Rutgers Law School. Okay, so let's talk about a very small portion of anti-discrimination law. So generally, these are the protected categories: race, national origin, color, religion, gender, age, disability, veteran status. That means that if someone discriminates against you because you are wearing a red jacket, that's not illegal, unless you can show that that red jacket is related to a protected category, that it's a proxy or it's a surrogate. Federal statutes. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Constitution, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Equal Protection, Fifth Amendment. It's mainly Equal Protection, First Amendment. But I will focus on the statutes because that tends to be what is being used to weaponize this very anti-Semitic definition of anti-Semitism. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act of 1994. The one that is at issue right now with the attacks on college campuses, it is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically Title VI. And just to note, every state usually has similar statutes that are just a mirror so that you can bring a state claim as well as a federal claim. These are the various titles of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the one, again, that matters for our imminent or immediate purposes is Title VI. And I highlighted Title VII. So Title VI is, it is illegal to discriminate based on race, color, and national origin in any program that receives federal funding. Now, you'll notice religion is not included. In fact, this is what caused me to write my book, The Racial Muslim, because I was trying to come up with a theory of liability. The Zionists have beat me to it, at least with regard to the way that they, I think, misdefine anti-Semitism. But nonetheless, I pointed out Title VII because that does include, that's employment, that does include religion. So the question is, how do you make Title VI apply to anti-Semitism, because it does not apply to Islamophobia or anti-Hindu bias or anti-Buddhist bias or any other anti-religious bias? Well, so let me step back just a minute and just repeat this. Anti-discrimination law is animated by the principle that individuals should be treated equally, regardless of their group affiliation. So essentialism is the belief that certain groups, racial, ethnic, gender, religious, usually a protected group, have inherent unchanging characteristics that define them. And as a result, it reinforces stereotypes, negative stereotypes, justifies prejudice, hinders equality. So to state what many of you may know in this room, but many in the public don't seem to know, not all Jews are Zionists. Not all Jews agree on the political solution to Israel and Palestine. Not all Jews are pro-Israeli. To assume that they are is essentializing. Jews are not identical, homogeneous, and monolithic. Okay, so the German journalist Wilhelm Marr popularized the term anti-Semitism. I believe it actually was first coined in 1860, if I'm not mistaken. There are experts in the room that know more about this than I do. But in 1879, it was popularized to describe his anti-Jewish ideology based on race, not religion, meaning the perversity of the way anti-Semitism is used today is it actually reinforces the eugenic treatment, racist treatment of Jews as a separate race, as a separate ethnicity, right? So Jews at the time were treated in Europe as a foreign, quote-unquote, Semitic race, referring to the language group that includes Hebrew. And in fact, in the US, and I'll send you back to my book, The Racial Muslim, where I talk about this, is the Hebrew race was a separate race in the Dictionary of Races during the eugenics period in the early 1900s. And it was used to justify that Jews were, well, the Hebrews were an inferior race to the Aryans, to the whites. So in this time period, ethno-nationalists rejected the political nation united in a social contract among citizens of the state. In other words, the nation was a biological community linked by common descent. This is a very racist period. This is an anti-Semitic period. Yet this is exactly the same logic that is paradoxically used to justify Zionism and the anti-Semitic essentialist definition of anti-Semitism. Now, what good faith civil rights advocates who in good faith seek to combat anti-Semitism, because in no way am I taking the position that anti-Semitism isn't real. I'm essentially stating that the way in which it is defined and enforced in practice in the US right now is incorrect and often in political bad faith. But currently, if used accurately, it is described anti-Jewish hostility or prejudice. Okay, so let's go back to the law. So those are kind of the overarching principles. Let's now explore if I'm right. So this is an executive order, 13899, that was issued on December 19th, 2019, during the first administration. The first is authoritarian 1.0. We are now in authoritarian 2.0. Americans want authoritarianism. They voted it twice. Title VI, sorry, sometimes I have to diverge. All right, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. We are learning that there are a plethora of programs across the country that receive federal funding because it is now being threatened to be cut off, including especially at universities. Now, these are quotes from the executive order. While Title VI does not cover discrimination based on religion, individuals who face discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin do not lose protection under Title VI for also being a member of a group that shares common religious practices. Okay, that could apply to any religion, right? Discrimination against Jews may give rise to a Title VI violation when the discrimination is based on an individual's race, color, or national origin. You could say the same thing about Muslims or Hindus. It shall be the policy of the executive branch to enforce Title VI against prohibited forms of discrimination rooted in anti-Semitism as vigorously as against all other forms of discrimination prohibited by Title VI. So it's almost as if they're adding anti-Semitism, even though they're acknowledging that religion is not the basis for which Title VI, because that's a statutory text. The executive branch cannot just change the statute. They've got to go through Congress for that. And I want to just note there is no executive order for Islamophobia. I mean, even though for the last 24 years, Muslims have been discriminated against at very high levels. And it's quite mainstreamed. Again, put a plug in for my book. Okay, so finally, the second part that matters is that this executive order adopted the definition, the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism adopted by IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Act, which I posit is the anti-Semitic definition of anti-Semitism because of the essentialization effect. This is the definition of it. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Certain perceptions of Jews, okay? Expressed as hatred, so that's easy. If you can show that hatred towards Jews, I don't think that's controversial. And this is where it gets, and as my co-panelist or former panelist, Professor Finkelstein mentioned, that any examples might be used as, the IHRA definition has examples of evidence of discriminatory intent. What are those? So they might include the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collective. So now you have to accept the fact that the state of Israel is a Jewish collective. What if you don't? What if you're Jewish and you don't? Criticism, now interestingly, white criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism, as anti-Semitic. Okay. However, there are certain examples in public life, the media, schools, workplace, and in the religious sphere that could, taking into account the overall context, include but are not limited to. And this is where it gets problematic. Claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, which IHRA definition argues means you're denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, which is really saying you're rejecting Jewish nationalism, right? But again, my question is, what do you do with the Jews who don't agree with this? Are they anti-Semitic? Because it assumes that all Jews agree on this. Apply double standards by requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. In other words, if the U.S. tortures, you can't criticize Israel for torturing. If the U.S. uses black sites, you can't criticize. So there's also a really interesting anti-imperialistic or pro-imperialist. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Okay, so this is the three I would argue are the most weaponized. And these are just examples. So even though the language says could, it's as if it shall. That's what's being interpreted. I thought I would do a little experiment. Because if the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is so strong and so accurate, I would like to propose we adopt the IRA definition of Islamophobia. And I would like to enforce it as rigorously and robustly against all university presidents, faculty, students, organizations, politicians. Islamophobia is a certain perception of Muslims which may be expressed as hatred toward Muslims. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of, Islamophobia are directed toward Muslim or non-Muslim individuals and or their property, toward Muslim community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, so then again, what are certain perceptions of Muslims? Well, manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Mauritania, or Pakistan because they all identify as Islamic republics, conceived as a Muslim collectivity. Criticism of these nation states, similar to that leveled against any other country, however, cannot be regarded as Islamophobic. However, contemporary examples of Islamophobia in public life, the media, schools, or workplace could include denying the Muslim people their right to self-determination, which would mean claiming that the existence of Iran, Afghanistan, Mauritania, or Pakistan is a racist endeavor is Islamophobic. The Zionists will have a big problem. Most Zionists are very, very critical of Iran, and in fact, they want to overthrow the Islamic regime and want to completely destroy Iran as an Islamic republic because they are opposed to that concept because they think that it's misogynistic, they think it's racist, they think it's anti-Semitic, they think all kinds of awful things. So all those people will now be sent to disciplinary proceedings. They will all be expelled from universities. They will all have their careers ruined. They will have their offers rescinded. They might join us in having our conference. Applying double standards by requiring of these countries a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, and drawing contemporary comparisons of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, sorry, that's supposed to be Mauritania, or Pakistan to the Nazis. And I could add like 10 other countries who have Islam as the state religion, but they don't necessarily call themselves an Islamic republic. But do you see how when you actually extend this exercise and if you say, okay, we're going to have a criteria, we're going to have rules, but we're going to apply it consistently. No special treatment for any group. It doesn't withstand scrutiny. Okay. So how does anti-Semitism get into Title VI? It's about shared ancestry. That's really the hook. And that is something that I think the experts on Jewish history are better equipped to debate, but that's effectively the legal argument. Now there is a scholarship about whether there is shared ancestry among Jews. It's a world religion where you have Eastern European, right? You have Ashkenazi, you have Sephardic, you have Mizrahim. I mean, it's a very diverse religion. It's a world religion. However, I will just note that relying on shared ancestry is exactly the same logic that was used by the Nazis, that was used by the eugenicists, that was used by the American Southern racists. They said Jews are separate. They're like this genetically different, inferior, separate race of people. So this is accepting at least the concept of shared ancestry, at least politically and normatively. And again, whether it's accurate scientifically or biologically is outside my area of expertise. And it incorrectly treats Israel as representing all Jewish people worldwide because it identifies as a Jewish state. And again, if you apply that to Iran, then you would have to accept that it represents all Shia Muslims. And then anytime someone is criticizing Iran, they are being, at the very least, anti-Shia Muslim, if not anti-Muslim. Erroneously assumes all Zionists are Jews and all Jews are Zionists, erroneously conflates Judaism, the religion, with the political ideology of Zionism. And then, as a result, rejection of Zionism is misinterpreted as anti-Semitic and hatred toward Jews. Any condemnation of Israel is misinterpreted as anti-Semitic and hatred toward Jews. And the support, and this is an interesting one, because this has also become more applicable, that even supporting a one-state binational or single-state solution is anti-Semitic, because that then rejects Israel as an exclusively Jewish state, right? That rejects Jewish nationalism. There's another problem with the definition. The majority of American Zionists in America are actually Christian. 10 million followers of the Christians United for Israel, 6 million followers of the Moral Majority by Jerry Falwell. Now it's now become the Liberty Federation. It's not as influential as it used to be, and I'm not stating that every single one of them are necessarily pro-Israeli, but Jerry Falwell certainly was. He is a Christian Zionist. Pat Robertson is a Christian Zionist. They have 2.3 million subscribers on YouTube. They have 1 million subscribers to 700 Club magazine. So all of these folks are told what? You must support Israel as part of your Christian beliefs, because the Messiah is not going to come back until the Jews come back to Israel, and then they will all die or convert, and we will go to heaven. It's very anti-Semitic justification. And the population of Jews in America is approximately 7 million, and not all of them are Zionists. So as you can see, the majority of Zionists in the United States are not Jewish. So what are the consequences? Well, legal liability for exercising your First Amendment right to free speech, expression, and association. In other words, this is not just an academic problem. This is not just some academic definitional dispute. This has very real consequences for people's rights and people's lives and people's safety and people's liberty and people's material state. Censorship of academic research, conferences, classrooms, discussions, and curriculum. And now we're seeing that those who were involved in the Gaza solidarity protests or made any statements or engaged in any advocacy that was critical of Israel or Zionism in the last especially 18 months are being deported, their student visas are revoked, their student visas are denied, and other adverse immigration action. And then it legitimizes anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Palestinian or human rights violations by private actors and states. And that's something else that I think is really important, is that the conversation around anti-Semitism, well, the anti-Semitic definition of anti-Semitism centers political Zionist Jewish groups and completely neglects and ignores the Palestinians. Nobody is asking, well, how do Palestinians feel? How do the Muslims feel? How are they uncomfortable? Are they feeling trauma? How are they being impacted in the last 18 months? So we're very keen, and our society wants to be very sensitive. It's fine, you want to be sensitive, it's fine, to how political Zionist Jewish communities have responded and have responded to the terrorist attacks or the militant terrorist attacks of October 7th, 2023 by Hamas. But nobody seems to care at all about how the Palestinians feel, about the Palestinians who've had tens, if not hundreds, of their family members murdered, their houses destroyed. There's people that are still there starving. Isn't that Islamophobic or anti-Palestinian racist? Okay, so let's look at the diversity of American Jewish opinions toward Palestine and Israel to show that they're essentializing them as all agreeing with AIPAC or all agreeing with J Street isn't accurate. So Jewish Electorate Institute had a 2021 survey, which is a little dated, says, do you agree that Israel is an apartheid state? And do you agree that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians? 25% agreed that Israel was an apartheid state. 22% agreed that Israel was committing genocide. This is in 2021. And 22% were unsure if Israel is an apartheid state. That's a pretty sizable minority. 52% disagreed that Israel was an apartheid state. 62% rejected the claim of genocide. And 24% agreed that accusing Israel of apartheid is anti-Semitic. Now, if you look at Jews under the age of 40 in 2021 in this survey, 38% agreed that Israel is an apartheid state, and 33% agreed that Israel is committing genocide, which is why probably you're seeing such a large number of Jewish Americans in the Gaza Solidarity movement in universities. And that's kind of the dirty little secret that nobody wants to talk about in the public, is that there is a significant number of Jews in these protests, in these encampments, in the conferences. So attacking them is kind of anti-Semitic. So in a 2020 survey, J Street asked, do you support providing the same amount of money the U.S. gives to Israel in military assistance, but restricting it so that no U.S. aid can be spent on annexation of the West Bank? 23% said strongly in favor, 34% somewhat in favor. So over 50% of Jewish respondents to the J Street survey support restricting, making conditional military aid to Israel. 34% were strongly in favor. So do you support restrict military aid to Israel so that it cannot be used to expand Israel's occupation of the West Bank? So 68% either strongly in favor or somewhat in favor. So this is where you're starting to see at least a pretty strong fault line in terms of the two-state solution. Do you support restricting U.S. aid so that this is in 2021, the next year, cannot spend on settlements? 29% strongly in favor, 30% somewhat in favor, but 25% opposed. So you do have a significant number, a significant minority that still support funding settlements with our money. This is a really interesting, again, it's 800 Jewish voters. I understand surveys. I'm just using this more for illustrative purposes because surveys are not perfect. But the question was, which of the following would be the best resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? This is the Jewish Electoral Institute National Jewish Survey 2021, 800 Jewish voters. 61% said establishing two separate states with their separate governments, a Jewish state of Israel alongside an independent Palestinian state. 20% said no, establishing one state that is neither Jewish nor Palestinian and includes Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza under a single government elected by Israelis and Palestinians. So all of those would be anti-Semitic under the IRA definition, because that means you're rejecting Jewish nationalism. Another 19% of American Jewish respondents support the Israeli annexation of the West Bank, that establishes one state as the national homeland of the Jewish people and allows Palestinians to vote for their municipal leaders, but not vote for Israel's national government. And presumably the end result of that is ethnic cleansing at some point, right? So that's also very troublesome. 19% is not a small number. Okay. I'm going to quickly go through this just because I think it's important. I won't read all of it, but just it's important to make the point again that there are a diversity of perspectives on Zionism. There's political Zionism, and there's the river to the sea, only Jews, only a Jewish homeland, political Zionism, and then there's the two-state solution, based on 1967 borders, political Zionism. There's non-Zionism, which was really historically based on supporting the transfer of Jewish displaced person to Palestine as a safe haven, but not necessarily creating a territorial separate Jewish state. And of course, there's anti-Zionism, which we talk about quite a bit in this conference, and then post-Zionism, which is interesting and becoming, I mean, I don't have a sense, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but my understanding is that this seems to be something that may be becoming more prevalent. is the recognition of the accomplishments of the basic ends of Zionism. And so now it's more about, we've already passed the becoming Zionist and we are in the being Zionist. And so we should focus more on making Israel a democracy for all its citizens, including Palestinians. But again, that doesn't necessarily solve the issue of military occupation, the West Bank and Gaza. I will just recommend that you look into the American Jewish Council, because it was a very influential and relatively large American Jewish organization that was anti-Zionist. Well, it still exists. It was created in 1906, but it actually petitioned President Wilson in 1919 and described Zionism as utterly opposed to the principles of democracy. The American Jewish Council was an integrationist organization in its initial phases up until 1967. And it essentially believed that Jewish people are members of their nation states and they should be equal citizens, and that there is no need to have Israel as a homeland in order for Jews to be safe. And in fact, we shouldn't accept that. All right. Currently, they support the two-state solution. And then you have cultural Zionism. And the other organization I would suggest you look into is BRIRA, a project of concern in diaspora-Israel relations. Now, this was out of the 1970s, out of the New Left. It was established in 1973. And it was a grassroots movement that was the first one to recognize the right of Palestinians to have a state. So before that, there was no two-state solution. Right? You could be anti-Zionist, or you could be one state just for Israel, or you would be non-Zionist. So they were the predecessor to J Street. And J Street is the mainstream, I would argue, increasingly mainstream two-state solution, liberal Zionist, mainly Democratic voters. And what I'm observing, but you should talk to the political scientists. Well, let me restate this. There is an important research question, a political science research question to be asked, which is there a shift in Jewish American voting patterns, and are they moving to the right? Because historically they were Democratic voters and very squarely within liberal American politics. But what we've seen in the last 2 years is more and more typically conservative, neoconservative, right-wing rhetoric and support for government policies, oftentimes under the guise of combating anti-Semitism, that contradicts many of the historic Jewish American support for civil rights and civil liberties. So that is a research question that still needs to be answered. But it does affect this question. The Anti-Defamation League, although it initially started as really focusing on anti-Semitism in the US, especially as it is caused by white nationalists and white supremacists, has become a pro-Israeli advocacy group. That is essentially its state, and it is one of the most aggressive organizations in terms of imposing the IRA definition for purposes of protecting Israel from criticism. And I think that is discrediting to an organization that historically used to actually be legitimately in good faith combating anti-Semitism, but has transitioned and transformed into one that really polices thought and polices academic conferences and polices politics for any kind of criticism of Israel and certainly criticism of political Zionism. And I just will note that it has been adamantly supportive of the congressional crackdowns on universities and Trump's crackdowns, and made a recent statement that when Musk made a clearly Nazi salute, stated, "This is a delicate moment. It's a new day, and yet so many are on edge. Our politics are inflamed, and social media only adds to the anxiety," said the ADL. It seems that Elon Musk made an awkward gesture in a moment of enthusiasm, not a Nazi salute, but again, we appreciate that people are on edge. If only they had had that level of nuance towards American college students. So they have discredited themselves. This is really important because this isn't being discussed. It's happening. Anyone who studies Israeli politics is seeing it. But political Zionism, the one-state solution only for Jews from the river to the sea, is becoming more popular in Israel, and it is starting to gain more traction within the American Jewish community. And nobody seems to be talking about that because they're so obsessed about the Palestinians saying from the river to the sea, even though the Palestinians are saying that could be two states or it could be one binational state, as opposed to looking back to 1960s and what a particular Palestinian group said. But the Zionist Organization of America probably is the most representative of that perspective. It is considered quite far right in the American Jewish establishment ecosystem. But I'll just note that Louis Brandeis was the head of it in 1914 to 1921, during which it was considered philanthropic Zionist, where he was mainly focused on collecting funds in order to assist Jewish displaced persons who were victims of pogroms in Eastern Europe, and to some extent also supporting Jews who were in Palestine who were able to flee. But Brandeis and ZOA, especially before 1948, were non-Zionist. Okay.
Time is our friend.
Okay. Last thing I just want to say. Let's talk about the current moment. So if you use the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, all of the, 83 local organizing groups, chapters in 25 cities, 50 college campus chapters, 2.3 million social media followers, which I know are not all members of Jewish Voice for Peace, 30,000 dues-paying members, which I know are not all Jewish. But all those people are anti-Semitic. And all those Jews that are part of this are anti-Semitic. If not now, which it identifies itself as anti-occupation, progressive internationalist grassroots movement, 22,000 members, but certainly doesn't agree with the IRA definition, they would be anti-Semitic. This is a lot of Jewish Americans that are all anti-Semitic if you use the IRA definition. So you can see that at some point the definition doesn't even make sense. Okay, finally, I just think it's really important. Why are American students of all races, ethnicities, and religious identities protesting on college campuses? It is not to express hatred toward Jews. It is to demand a ceasefire in Gaza, to stop Israel's bombing of hospitals in Gaza, to stop Israel's bombing of UN shelters in Gaza, to stop Israel's bombing of schools and universities in Gaza, to stop Israel's targeted assassinations of Palestinian journalists, to stop the killing of Palestinians by the Israeli military, which has reached 50,000 plus thousands unidentified killed under the rubble, including 18,000 Palestinian children, to stop Israel's systematic starvation of Palestinians since October 8, 2023, to persuade their U.S. government to publicly condemn Israel's disproportionately violent and collective punishment of all Palestinians in Gaza for the Hamas attacks on October 7, 2023, to persuade their U.S. government to stop funding the Israeli military and, by extension, Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, to persuade their U.S. government to pressure Israel into entering a permanent ceasefire. Is there anything in there that says to hate Jews? No. This is why this entire 18 months is really more of a political witch hunt. And I think it makes Jews less safe in the long run. It makes Palestinians less safe now and in the long run, and Muslims and Arabs less safe now and in the long run, and anyone who wants to express solidarity with Palestinian human rights unsafe now and in the long run. But it also makes Jews unsafe in the long run. Okay. So finally, please read this report, Presumptively Anti-Semitic Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, where we talk about these issues. And these are my book recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. No worries, Max. We have maybe 5 minutes for questions, if we can squeeze that time. So we will have our presenters back up in the front. Professor Magloire can join. A reminder that, especially given how little time we have, concision is king. So please ask a simple, pointed question, and mics will go around the room. Yes, I see Amber raising a hand in the back.
Hello. I hope, yeah, I think it's on. Thank you both so much for your presentations. I have a very quick question for Professor Aziz, which is, could you share some examples of cases that are, using the Title VI definition and kind of bringing in some of the examples that you talked about the problems with essentializing Jews through the Title VI, especially I think on university campuses. This is being used, from my understanding. So if you could just share some examples, I would appreciate it.
Hello. Thank you both so much for your presentations. I was wondering also for Dr. Aziz, if you could talk about the parallel legal movement that sort of grants that there is a Jewish left that is not Zionist, but is actually working to legislate and to sort of use legal mechanisms to conflate Jewishness and Zionism, such that Jews who don't hold by Zionist beliefs actually won't be considered Jewish under the law. So there was a ruling at UCLA in response to the student who was refused access to the Solidarity Compartment because he was there to dock students. And the legal ruling, I don't know the exact specifics of it, but the judge basically was talking about, like, if Zionism is a constitutive element of Jewish identity, then therefore Jews themselves who don't fall within that are not Jewish. And then there's the discourse sort of surrounding it of the un-Jew, and that has sort of been popularized in the media among right-wing Jewish thinkers.
Thank you for the excellent presentations. I wonder, this is a question for both of you, but whether in your reflections and in the sources that you've been working with, you see any kind of critique of the state as a primary source of violence and as the concept of the state itself as being the origin of these problems, whether there's anti-statist discourses that are happening within the movements of the Black, lesbian, feminist. So it's basically like this whole problem seems to be oriented towards trying to get the state to do something differently, and maybe the state is actually the source of the problem and the source of the violence.
I think the question with IRA was, you were asking whether in fact IRA does apply in the Title VI cases. Oh, there's quite a few. Yeah. So as a general matter, I mean, we're actually in the process of doing a review. I think we've identified over 100 cases just in the last 2 years. But as a general matter, you should assume that IRA is the definition that Jewish students or organizations or faculty are using when alleging anti-Semitism within university contexts, which is through the administrative. They start with the administrative complaint process, and then they may go to court depending on the basis for their discrimination claim. Now, whether or not the university adopts IRA depends on two things. If it has formally adopted it, like what Harvard did, and I believe did in Columbia, I believe, and that's why there's so much pressure for them to adopt IRA, because of everything that I just talked about. Because if a university formally, in its policy, adopts IRA, then now anybody who criticizes political Zionism in a way that the decision maker determines is anti-Semitic, then they've discriminated. Right? The defendant has been found to discriminate, and it really is just based on Zionism being conflated with Judaism and Israel being conflated with Judaism. The other reason it would happen is if the state has adopted it as a state law. And that is also something that some states have done. New Jersey, there every year it gets proposed and more people, state legislators sign it. So once it's law, then it doesn't matter whether the university formally adopts it. But again, that's why they want to do it, because it is a very powerful weapon of censorship. But not only is it a powerful weapon of censorship, it is a powerful weapon of essentialization, because now it is telling all Jews, you cannot criticize Zionism. You cannot criticize the concept of a Jewish state. So if you believe in a binational secular democratic state where it doesn't matter what your religious identity is, all citizens are equal, you're anti-Semitic. But you could be a Jewish person who supports that. So it's like telling Muslims, if you don't support the political Islamist ideology of Al-Qaeda, you're Islamophobic. And we're not only going to just call you a name, we're going to hurt you in your schooling, we're going to hurt you in your employment, we might take away your liberty, affect your immigration rights if you're not a citizen. So it's quite harmful, not just to the non-Jewish community, but also to the Jewish community. With regard to the judges, so the general rule is, I'm not familiar with the UCLA, that particular case. There's too many universities to keep up with. But as a matter of law, when religious freedom cases are before a court, where usually they will allege they've been discriminated against, or that because they weren't accommodated when they should have been, or because someone disparately treated them or harassed them, the judge cannot decide what the religion is. The judge's role is to determine whether it's a genuinely held belief for that particular person. And then you get into objective and subjective analysis. But courts cannot, because that would actually contradict the Establishment Clause, the courts cannot go and say, well, we've decided that this interpretation of Islam is the right one and this is the wrong one, or that this interpretation of Christianity is the right one or the wrong one. It's more about, is that your genuinely held belief? And then you look into whether the other person knew that and whether objectively what they did was discriminatory, and it goes into that analysis. So to the extent that a judge is saying, this is what Judaism is, that would be highly problematic, and I mean, without knowing any of the details, I can see it being ripe for appeal. But it may be that, again, it depends on whether they're talking about they might be talking about the genuinely held belief of that person, but that's not the end of the inquiry. You still have to determine the objective analysis, because if you had no idea, right? And it will clash up against free speech, because there are different interests. And so the other thing that we're seeing in all this is that as the free speech is just as if it doesn't exist. It's almost as if we're in Europe, because Europe does not protect speech that can be found offensive to minority communities. And America is much more purist in its free speech, which has costs. I mean, I can tell you as a Muslim and as someone who's been researching Islamophobia, Muslims have been emotionally harmed, psychologically harmed, offended by all sorts of very hateful things said about Muslims and Islam, but it has never been illegal, and never has it been, in other words, as I point out in my presentation, if the enforcement level against what was happening to Muslims in the last 25 years had happened similar to what's happening with this anti-Semitism IRA definition, you would have a lot of faculty that have been fired, administrators that have been fired, and students that would have been expelled, and conferences that have been canceled. But that's not the case. And I'm not saying that that's what I support. I'm just trying to highlight how problematic IRA is. I'm going to let you deal with the state, non-state, because I'm too wedded to the state as a lawyer, unfortunately.
Wait, but did we have a couple more questions? I can take a stab at that, but I guess, I don't know, should we let people ask a couple more, and then I can maybe take, if they are for me, I can go ahead.
I just have oh, sorry, this is really loud. I just had a question about, just in light of, there was a lot of like debate and concern of like anti-blackness within the pro-Palestinian movement.
And just seeing how you kind of laid out this new way of making home through black feminist anti-Zionism. And do you see any way that this is a potential to present like the ability to unify, like I guess like Black thought in this kind of anti-Zionist solidarity? Because like Frank Wilderson does not really is anti-Zionist, but is also not super into working together. Like doesn't think that that's possible. So just kind of wanted to see where you think this could go and its potential for unifying like Black radical thought for pro-Palestinian efforts, and maybe vice versa.
A question from here. And I ask this as someone who's been engaged in Trenton and elsewhere in trying to block New Jersey's adoption of the IRA definition, and also as someone old enough to be an alumnus of Pre-Ra. There is still the question of the definition of Jew and Jewish, and religion just hasn't cut it as being adequate definition of community or whatever. The American Council for Judaism was not an organization that anyone in this room would have liked. Its definition of as Jews as people who believe in the 5 books of Moses and should do it on Sunday and assimilate to a very conservative mainstream American identity is not something that would fly in 2025. So what is the, or should be the usable definition of Jewish for purposes of your analysis? Unless you want to, it sounded like you were mostly saying it's a religion, but I think you're prepared to realize that it's more. So what is it?
Okay, bookmark that. I will try to answer the state question and the question about anti-Blackness and coalition building as well. So there's definitely a lot of conflicting attitudes towards the state and how it should be used in Black feminism from the time period that I'm talking about. But I think it's interesting that everybody is interested in revolution, interested in the term revolution, just in terms of how you get there, what you do after, are extremely divergent. So even, June Jordan, even though I think I'm identifying her as like somewhat less compromising and reformist on this particular issue than some of her contemporaries, I do think that she wrote to Congress, she wrote to Congress people who who spoke on Palestinian rights, and she was like, thank you. She was not necessarily anti-electoral. She supported different campaigns and politicians strategically. So even though she was also she literally wrote, we need an intifada in the USA. And I think that the end of Black folks in foreign policy that I read is quite, I would probably argue somewhat anti-statist, and perhaps it's at least anti-state, anti-capitalist and anti the U.S. as a state, because policing is so at the heart of the U.S. state that I think in the Black radical tradition there's not a lot of redemptive readings of the state. But in terms of should another state come after, I'm not really sure. I'm really not sure. And I guess in terms of the question about coalition building, anti-Blackness, it's kind of interesting because I think I was really debating coming here. Also, as one, I guess the only Black presenter, and a lot of actually the pushback that I have received on this essay is from other Black women who think that it's kind of airing an intra-community conflict. But for me, I feel like I'm kind of trying to push back against the Mammyization of Black women's thought, where people, will just assume that anything a Black woman has ever said has the moral high ground to the detriment of our political rigor. So I think for me, solidarity is not transactional. I don't okay, sometimes people are anti-Black and, Black people participate in capitalism and pay American tax dollars. We're even. I don't know, I'm not overly concerned, I guess, with I'm not overly concerned, and I think neither was June Jordan with this kind of tit for tat model of solidarity, because I mean I think June Jordan, and I think I am as well, just a bit third worldist in my orientation, and that we have a common goal, and no, we're not going to be identitarian aligned necessarily all of the time. We are going to hurt each other and fail each other. But I just hope that, I think Jordan is a really great model in kind of showing this and kind of modeling this non-transactional solidarity in a way that I think was reciprocated in her life, and that I see reciprocated from Palestinian comrades of mine as well. I've definitely noticed shifts in people's support for Black causes as well, in a kind of dialogic way. So I hope that answers your question.
We are going to have to wait for the final question, which is an excellent question because we are for sure out of time now.
I really want to answer this.
But
it's important.
Max will be so sad if
Just give me a minute. 1 minute. I want to answer the next question. It's a really good question. Okay, so I just want to tell you because it's important for the law. The first is, who is Jewish for what purpose? So I'm looking at the law. So who is Jewish for religious purposes is different than who is Jewish for social purposes versus who is Jewish for legal purposes. Legally speaking, judges cannot tell someone you are Jewish or you are not Jewish. They can't. That's anti-establishment. If someone says, I am Jewish, and I subjectively believe that, as far as the law is concerned, okay, I'm not here to judge you. Now, the rabbi may not agree, the Jewish community may not agree. Second, what Title VI covers is really, it does not cover religion, period. That affects any religion. So that's why the definition of being Jewish comes up in Title VI of shared ancestry. Third is, what constitutes anti-Semitism? Is it hatred towards Jews, prejudice towards Jews, discrimination because someone is Jewish? And what if Jewish is actually Zionist, so same? Or if Jewish is pro-Israeli, same? Then you have a problem, because you have 25 to 40% of Jews who will say, no, I am not a Zionist, but I'm a Jew. Or I'm not a political Zionist, I might be a non-Zionist, I might be a post-Zionist, whatever, there's different things. So that's really the fundamental problem that IRA raises.
Thanking our presenters. We will be taking a 10-minute break before the final panel. So Millabout and me, Barry. Thank you.